In 1842, when the famed novelist Charles Dickens ventured into Manhattan's notorious five-point slum, he left quite an interesting remark. All that is loathsome, drooping, and decayed is here. 5 Points was America's first and most infamous urban slum. It was a maze of narrow, foul-smelling alleys, crumbling tenements tucked away, just a short walk from City Hall. Dickens and other aghast visitors described collapsing wooden buildings with rotten beams, windows patched with rags, and pigs roaming the trash-strewn streets alongside gangs of ragged children. In fact, in one overcrowded tenement, Dickens saw heaps of people sleeping in darkness, so tightly packed that even the rats were driven out to seek space elsewhere. It's a visceral account, don't you think? Well, it brought home to the wider world the appalling living conditions endured by the poorest of New York City. The 19th century in New York was certainly an era of explosive growth, but also of jarring contrasts. You see, beneath the prosperity of the Gilded Age mansions and bustling commerce lurked teeming enclaves of the most miserable poverty. By the 1880s, 3/4 of New York City's population lived in tenement housing, dense clusters of low-rent buildings where squalor, disease, and misery festered in those close quarters. And as you can imagine, life in the slums was defined by extremes of overcrowding and deprivation. Families of 10 or more occupied single rooms no larger than a small office. Whole tenement blocks lacked running water or sanitation, and epidemics swept these neighborhoods repeatedly. Crime flourished in dark alleyways named for their dangers. Places like Murderer's Alley and Bandit's Roost became grimly literal. But you know, we must go there if we want to figure out what it was like. So today's a snapshot of the life at the lowest level of society in the New York slums. Let me welcome you to the channel first. If you're new here, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, good to see you again. As always, if you've not hit that subscribe button, I advise you to do so, and allow me to remind you once more that this channel is completely ad-free. You won't get any interruptions from start to finish of the videos, and this is because we are rather supported by our Patreon members, the YouTube members, the occasional donation, whether it be through the PayPal link or the Super Thanks, and also, of course, the merch store. But if you want to help us out, just a like, comment, subscribe, and hitting the hype button, perhaps telling your friends about the channel too, that's worth quite a lot to us too. So thank you very much in advance for your support, and with that all being said, I hope you enjoy the video. Let's begin. And we begin at the dawn of the 19th century. And let's take a look at New York at the time. It wasn't the big city it was today. It was more of a compact port town at the southern tip of Manhattan. And the population? At the time, around a little bit under 100,000. But that would change pretty quickly. Within a few decades, it transformed into a swelling metropolis. The catalyst for New York's slum conditions was a massive population boom. Immigration after the War of 1812, and the city's commercial expansion brought a flood of newcomers. And by 1850, that little port city of under 100,000 had grew to 500,000, all crowding into Manhattan. And by 1870, nearly 1 million. Now, doubling in 20 years, that's really not a sustainable pace. While the demand for cheap housing, of course, skyrocketed, and unscrupulous landlords seized an opportunity. As wealthier citizens moved uptown, their old row houses and downtown districts were swiftly carved up into tiny rental units for low-income tenants. Thus, the first tenements were born. They were not purpose-built apartment blocks at first. but former single-family homes, crudely subdivided, floor by floor, room by room. One of the earliest and most infamous slum neighborhoods was the 5 Points, located near the Old Collect Pond in Lower Manhattan. 5 Points emerged in the 1820s and 30s as poor immigrants, especially the Irish, by the way, fleeing famine, and free black residents too, squeezed into a rundown area built atop a marshy landfill. Yes, certainly quite a foundation. The land is absolute trash. Well, the neighborhood took its name from the intersection of the 5 streets that met at a raucous little plaza, and it quickly earned international notoriety, not as a shiny new estate in a shiny new city, but more of a cesspit of vice and poverty. Of course, this didn't affect the prices of the rents, of course, they only went up. Funny how that works. In any case, a local brewery abandoned after the Panic of 1837 became the notorious Old Brewery Tenement, a 5-story brick building so decayed and so dangerous that it was said to be, quote, one vast dark vault, alive with vermin and human misery. Well, by the 1840s, the old brewery housed over 1,000 desperate souls in windowless cubicles and cellars. An alley only 3 feet wide encircling it was aptly nicknamed Murderer's Alley, and one interior cabin was called the Den of Thieves, reputed to shelter 75 criminals at a time. When reformers finally bought and demolished the old brewery in 1852, human bones were found interred in its walls, grim evidence of the violence that had unfolded within. Generally, we don't use human bones as construction equipment. Well, 5 Points in its heyday was a melting pot of the underclass. Newly arrived Irish families crammed into the dilapidated tenements alongside African Americans in a smattering of other immigrants. Contemporary observers provide harrowing snapshots of the scene. Now, besides Dickens' often quoted impressions, which are, well, yes, pretty stark, I suppose, police and missionaries who also ventured into 5 Points spoke of block after block of gin shops and brothels, drunken brawls spilling into the streets, and entire buildings reeking from open privies and rotting garbage. Well, in 1842, Dickens was guided at night through the slum's narrow passages by a police officer. Well, what he described there was dim lantern light revealing large mounds of filthy rags upon the ground, which astonishingly began to stir. They were not just piles of rags, they were indeed piles of sleeping people who arose in tattered blankets as the visitors passed. In one fetid attic, one man sat delirious with fever in total darkness. In another windowless loft, dozens of half-clad women and children huddled around a single charcoal fire, the air so foul that Dickens gagged when he entered the room. He wrote in horror, "Conceive the fancies of a fevered brain in such a place like this." 5 Points streets had accumulated filthy mud knee-deep high in places, and even on bright days the sun scarcely penetrated the crowded alleys. Underlying these hellish descriptions were the broader social forces. A rapid influx of poor immigrants, especially Irish during the Great Famine, overwhelmed the city's housing capacity. Tenements multiplied in the spaces left by industry and commerce. Within the 5 Points area, old workshops and stables were repurposed as shanties or cheap lodging houses. Just for one example, a decommissioned ship dock at the East River was moored and used to shelter homeless paupers at one point, showing once again the extremes of makeshift housing. The city's rudimentary infrastructure struggled to keep up. There was no citywide sewage system either until the late 1850s. Sewers, where they existed, emptied directly into the streets or into local ponds. Clean water, that was scarce too before the Croton Aqueduct opened in 1842. Prior to that, many tenement dwellers relied on contaminated wells, or even the polluted Collect Pond, filled in 1811, contributing directly to disease spread. Of course, speaking of disease, there was plenty of epidemics to go around, and they struck in the slums with a vengeance. Cholera, that was a big issue. Massive outbreak in 1832, and 5 Points was the epicenter. Spread by water tainted with sewage, cholera tore through the packed tenements. Those who could afford fled the city, while the poor, they were trapped. Over 3,500 New Yorkers died in a few months, many of them in the infested courts and cellars of the 5 Points. One city leader, in a disturbingly cold remark, suggested that the epidemic, quote, chiefly affected the very scum of the city, and that the quicker that they perished, the sooner the disease would end. Well, that's pretty cold-hearted, isn't it? Well, it's a callous attitude for sure. But attitudes like that toward the slum population were quite common among the elites at the time. Cholera returned in 1849, and even more fiercely, again cutting down thousands. Over 2,500 died in July 1849 alone. Again, the worst mortality was in the overcrowded downtown wards. It only makes sense if you know a little bit about how diseases spread. But these disasters finally spurred some action. It usually takes a big event like this, a big pile of dead people, for the government to really do anything. In the 1840s and 50s, the city began to take halting measures towards sanitation, forbidding pigs to roam the streets. In fact, the pigs had doubled as informal garbage disposals in the slums. And they created a Board of Health, too, in 1866, and commissioning studies on tenement conditions. By 1855, even in a non-epidemic year, the annual death rate in the city had climbed to about 1 in 27 people, far worse than earlier decades, a rise that was attributable largely to filthy tenement districts. Reformers realized that the tenements were breeding grounds for disease that did not politely remain confined to the poor. Outbreaks could and did spread uptown, and you can only imagine who they were blaming for that. One seminal investigation was the 1864-65 Council of Hygiene report, organized by the Citizens Association of New York. Teams of physicians exhaustively surveyed the sanitary state of every district, and they found block after block of tenements with overflowing cesspools, stagnant water, and what they called fever nests. A map of one cholera-ridden block showed rows of buildings with virtually zero ventilation, and primitive privies leaking into the soil. In one notorious tenement, known as Gotham Court on Cherry Street, 2 long 5-story buildings packed in 360 people. Investigators noted that each person in Gotham Court had on average only 275 cubic feet of living space, roughly the volume of a small closet. It was a literal crush of humanity. The report dryly observed that such crowding was, quote, wholly incompatible with health. Well, that's to say the least. But not surprisingly, Gotham Court had been the site of a recurrent smallpox and typhus epidemics. The council's final report in 1865 was even more scathing, concluding that New York's tenant houses were largely, quote, filthy, unventilated, and overcrowded, not to mention directly responsible for the excess deaths. It recommended new housing laws and proper sanitation. Partly as a result, New York State passed the first Tenement House Act in 1867, the first in the nation to regulate things like ventilation, sewage, and fire escapes in multi-family buildings, by the way. There's one for your next trivia night. But despite modest reforms after the Civil War, the reality of daily life in the slums remained extremely harsh. By the 1870s and 80s, purpose-built tenement buildings had sprung up across Manhattan's Lower East Side, Little Italy, and other poor districts, as well as parts of Brooklyn. These were typically narrow brick structures, 5 to 7 stories tall, jammed back to back along narrow streets. A standard tenement might only be 25 feet wide, with 4 apartments per floor, 2 in front, 2 in the back, divided by a dark central hall. To maximize rentable space, builders sacrificed light and air. Many interior rooms had no windows at all, and these became the infamous dark bedrooms that bred tuberculosis and all sorts of other goodies. Early tenements had virtually no ventilation, and after 1867, air shafts were eventually required, but the air shaft on an 1870s tenement was often a tiny courtyard or a gap only a few feet wide, essentially an inner chimney that unfortunately served more to spread fires and odors rather than to provide fresh air. Bit of a waste of time. Anyway, inside the tenements, every square foot was precious. A single room of perhaps 10 by 12 feet was commonly a family's entire home. In that tight space, a family cooked, ate, slept, and took in whatever scant leisure was possible. One contemporary journalist described visiting a tenement apartment where a single room was parlor, kitchen, bedroom, and workshop for a family of 6. The parents and infants slept in a bed, the older children on the floor, and personal privacy, well, non-existent. Additionally, due to desperate economics, families often took in lodgers, single men or couples who paid small sums to sleep in a cot or a share of the bed. This extra income helped offset the rent, which, ironically, was not cheap relative to incomes. Slum landlords charged what they could. Rents in the worst tenements might actually be higher per square foot than in the nicer uptown dwellings, because landlords knew that multiple wage earners were pooling resources in one room. In one documented case from the 1880s, a poor African-American family paid $8.50 a month for a single tiny attic room in a rear house slum off West 3rd Street. Now, the room was so minuscule that a reporter, Jacob Reese, could not even fit his camera inside to photograph it unless he knocked out a wall. Now, that rent, exorbitant at the time, had to be met whether or not the family had work each month. Otherwise, well, you just get kicked out, wouldn't you? Overcrowding in the districts is really hard to overstate. Official statistics from 1880 revealed that Manhattan had an average of 16 people living in each dwelling, that is, house or building, double that figure in London, or nearly 3 times of that in Philadelphia. The density in the most packed tenement wards was astounding. The 11th ward, mostly the Lower East Side, had around 224,000 people per square mile in 1880, and in 1890, one part of the 10th ward, the heart of the Jewish immigrant quarter, reached up to 334,000 people per square mile, and that is possibly the highest residential density recorded anywhere in the world at that time. Such overcrowding meant every building was filled to the rafters, every space overflowing. A New York State legislative report in 1857 had already warned that these conditions were creating a dangerous class of citizens, noting what began as a blessing, i.e., cheap housing for workers, had degenerated into nightmarish exploitation. The report observed that large rooms had been partitioned into several smaller ones without regard to light or ventilation, filled from cellar to the garret with a class of tenantry living from hand to mouth, loose in morals, improvident in habits, degraded and squalid as beggary itself. Quite a one-star review, isn't it? Of course, this mid-century description remained quite apt decades later. Things changed slowly, I suppose. Now, sanitation, that was possibly one of the thorniest issues of the slum life. Basic amenities that we all take for granted, clean water, garbage collection, indoor toilets, well, they were luxuries in the slum. After 1842, the Croton Aqueduct brought fresh water into Manhattan, but installing plumbing, well, that was a completely different thing. That cost money. So, many tenements did not have running water in each apartment. Instead, there was a common spigot in the yard, or perhaps on the ground floor, that served dozens of families. In summer, there'd be long lines of residents, often children sent with buckets, waiting to fetch water, only to find the spigot sometimes broken or dry. A notorious situation in one tenement block was described as, quote, 1,000 thirsty throats panting for a cooling drink, while the only pump had run dry. Yet a tavern on the corner continued to serve beer, though, showing that alcohol was sometimes even more accessible than water was, especially clean water. Now, as for the bathroom situation, well, the early tenements relied on outhouse privies in the backyard, typically a row of brick outhouses, served an entire building, and these privies often overflowed. The 1865 sanitary survey found that in some wards less than 30% of the privies were connected to any sewer line. The rest just drained into the soil, or into stagnated pits. The smell in summer, well, can only be imagined. Imagine the smell. Tenants might go on the roof or use a pail indoors rather than brave the fetid backyard at night. And you can understand why the miasma theory, that bad air theory of disease, seemed quite plausible when such foul odors were ever present. Well, furthermore, many poor individuals literally lived below the minimum standards of the tenement. Cellar dwellings were officially banned by the Tenement Act of 1867, but for years afterwards, reformers found hundreds of people living in cellars and basements. These were damp, sunless places prone to flooding, breeding grounds for deadly diseases like typhus. In 1879, a survey counted over 3,000 basement lodging houses still operating illegally in New York City. One such place had been a church basement. Another was a former stable. These underground dens might rent a spot on the floor for a few cents a night to destitute laborers or recent immigrants with nowhere else to go. And given these conditions, certainly no surprise that death was everywhere. Infant and child mortality was especially tragic. In some slum precincts, 1 in every 10 babies died before their first birthday, a rate several times higher than in wealthier neighborhoods. Jacob Rees, who we did mention before, analyzing city health data, noted that... Oh, hang on. Oh, sorry, I lost the place I was reading for a moment. Excuse me. He noted that in the worst old law tenements, that child death exceeded 100 per 1,000 living children in a year. So we're talking 10%. And those are not good odds. I'm not a math magician, but certainly not good odds at all. Diseases like measles, diphtheria, and of course diarrhea swept through the congested buildings, and they took a horrific toll on the young. Summer heat brought waves of cholera, infantum, a deadly dehydration disease, illness in babies. The overall death rate in New York gradually improved by the 1880s as public health measures took effect, falling from about 26 deaths per 1,000 people in 1880 to 22.5 by 1889. Decent progress, but it still remained far higher than in London, or at least the national average. And within the city, the tenement districts had a death rate nearly double that of the better residential districts in the newer parts. Well, in 1888, for example, almost 25,000 New Yorkers died in tenement houses, roughly 60% of all deaths in the city. Every contagious illness found fertile ground in these quarters, especially tuberculosis. They used to call it the White Plague. It flourished in the dark, damp flats, and one could identify tenement houses by the multiple faded black crepe funeral ribbons hanging from their doors at any given time. But beyond the grim statistics, accounts of daily life show how slum dwellers actually coped with all this. Morning in a tenement might begin with the cries of a dozen babies echoing through the thin walls, the clatter of many families cooking on their tiny stoves in close proximity, trying not to set the whole place on fire, and the scramble to use an outdoor water pump or privy before heading off to work, if you had work, that is. Many tenement women actually took work in piecework, things like sewing garments or rolling cigars, earning a few pennies from home, since they had to be there all day to mind the children, right? Visitors described entire families bending over heaps of clothing in stifling apartments, sewing on buttons or finishing seams for 10 or 15 cents apiece. Child labor was ubiquitous. Small boys and girls helping their mothers finish garment piecework, a practice known as the sweating system. Or they just scavenged in the streets for rags and coal. One famous photograph by Jacob Rees shows a 12-year-old boy in Ludlow Street tenement sweatshop with a large bruise on his face, pausing from pulling threads out of cut cloth. An emblem of hardship, perhaps. His family likely needed every bit of income he could bring. And sure, he was 12 years old. It's young, but old enough to work, I'm afraid. And speaking of the work, when everything was done, the narrow streets themselves became the living space for thousands who had no other. Contemporary writers often remarked that slum streets were always crowded with children playing, hawkers selling food, women doing laundry, unemployed men idling on stoops, and so on. With tiny homes, much of life just spilled outside. And in summer, entire families might sleep on the fire escapes or roofs to escape the deathly heat inside. As for the winter, people huddled around minimal coal stoves. If they lacked fuel, they might burn scraps of wood or even old shoes. Visitors to tenements in winter noted windows nailed shut to keep out drafts, buildings with no heating, and resultant foul airs and moisture condensing on the walls. Of course, under such stress, it's no wonder everybody was getting sick all the time. I suppose you would have the constant accompaniment of that coughing and wheezing in the background wherever you went. Well, of course, it wasn't all about the disease. There were also breeding grounds for crime and social ills. Densely packed and neglected by authorities, these neighborhoods offered abundant hideouts for criminal elements. 5 Points in the mid-1800s became synonymous with gangs and lawlessness, which I have made a full video about the gangs of New York, but just in case you haven't watched that, or you don't want to, we'll go over it in this video in this section. So groups like the Dead Rabbits, Irish American Duffs, and the Bowery Boys, my pronunciation corrected from the previous video, native-born toughs, that is, fought pitched battles in the streets. Well, the 5 Points taverns and dance halls were notorious too. One establishment, named Almack's, became legendary after Dickens described its interracial clientele dancing wildly to fiddle music in squalid surroundings. And then, of course, was the prostitution. That was widespread too. Certain alleyways were lined with brothels catering to sailors and slum residents alike. Old Brewery, before its demolition, reportedly saw a murder every single night in its heyday, hence the name Murderer's Alley, which we mentioned. Maybe it's an exaggeration, but still crime rates were undoubtedly higher in these impoverished quarters, Citywide police statistics from the late 1880s revealed that arrests for drunkenness, assault, and theft clustered heavily in the tenement districts. Alcohol abuse was both a cause and effect of some slum misery. Saloons also dotted every block. By 1889, New York had nearly 8,000 licensed saloons, and that's roughly one for every 400 people. But that's not to mention the countless unlicensed ones. In the slums, a corner saloon served as a social hub and also a bit of an escape. Workers spent hard-earned pennies on the growler, a tin pail of beer, that is, to share at home, or on cheap rum sold by the ladleful in cellar bars. Reformers lamented that income which should buy food for children was wasted on drinking. Yet for many impoverished laborers, a few drinks were the only comfort that they could have in their bleak little world. One 1890 report estimated that 40% of the distress among the poor could be traced in some way back to alcohol, though it also acknowledged deeper roots in the brutal living conditions themselves. Perhaps we can see a lot of parallels with the modern day with alcohol and poor living conditions as well. Some things never change, I'm afraid. But then there was gambling, petty thievery, and just general violence. Common companions to these saloons. Gangs of adolescent thieves and pickpockets roamed the waterfront and Bowery areas. They snatched purses, picked pockets, and occasionally they mugged intoxicated passers-by. In the chaotic draft riots of 1863, which started as a protest by mostly Irish slum residents against Civil War conscription, mob violence and lynchings raged on for days, an eruption of pent-up anger from the slums that shook the city's core. But in calmer times, crime often took on an organized character. The infamous 5 Points Thieves' Exchange, for instance, was a semi-fenced market where stolen goods could be bought or traded, operating openly under the noses of corrupt local precinct men. Children growing up to the slums, of course, were exposed quite early to vice. Many became, as they were called, street Arabs, as the 19th century writers used to say, homeless or neglected children who lived by their wits. They shined shoes, sold newspapers, or just begged for money. At night they might sleep in doorways or huddled around bonfires in an empty lot. In 1874, one charitable organization census counted over 10,000 vagrant children in New York City. Some of these youths fell under the sway of gang leaders or criminal fencers, that is, receivers of stolen goods, graduating, of course, into delinquency. The city's first juvenile reformatories were founded in this period to deal with what was seen as an alarming menace of dangerous street boys. Charles Loring Brace, a noted child welfare reformer, wrote passionately about these children in The Dangerous Classes of New York, a work of 1872, warning that uneducated, street-hardened youth would become the next generation of criminals and political repeaters, that is, election fraudsters. Brace founded the Children's Aid Society, which famously began sending orphaned or delinquent city children to farming families in the Midwest on orphan trains, a controversial attempt to rescue children from the slums by relocating them entirely. Certain slum districts specialized in particular kinds of vice. For example, the 4th Ward, a waterfront area by the East River, was notorious for crimp houses, that is, saloons that drugged sailors to kidnap them for ship crews, and for harboring river pirates too. There were plenty of them around. Now, the 6th Ward in 5 Points was more associated with gang warfare and prostitution. By the 1880s, a West Side enclave named Hell's Kitchen, around West 39th Street near 10th Avenue, had become an Irish-American slum with a fearsome reputation for violence. Tenements in Hell's Kitchen had names like Battle Row and Sebastopol, a later reference to a Crimean War siege implying the building was a fortress of outlaws that police struggled to subdue. and indeed confrontations between residents and police in these areas could be quite fierce. An officer venturing into Hell's Kitchen alone at night might risk being assaulted or even killed. Either way, he was getting robbed. Gangs like the Hell's Kitchen Gang and the Gopher Gang ruled the streets there around the turn of the century. But despite the prevalence of crime, it's important to note that the vast majority of slum residents were law-abiding people just trying to get by. The environment, however, was, well, criminogenic. That is, fostering crime by its own nature. The lack of decent employment opportunities, the overcrowding and anonymity, which made it easier to evade identification, and at times the complicity of corrupt officials. Some ward bosses protected criminal enterprises in exchange for votes or payoffs. They all contributed to a high crime rate. And here's a telling statistic. In the late 1880s, about 1 in every 4 arrests in New York was for public intoxication or disorderly conduct, showing how everyday social ills played out in public among the cramped quarters of the poor. Meanwhile, the city's jails, workhouses, and lunatic asylums were filled up year after year by thousands drawn from the tenement districts. Jacob Riis quipped that each year in the slums they threw off a scum of 40,000 human wrecks to the island asylums and workhouses, and produce an army of tramps and paupers that society must then support. Hyperbolic language, sure, but it showed a genuine cycle, I think. The slum spread sickness and delinquency, that ultimately burdened the entire city. After all, we all have to live in the same society. But the slums didn't remain static in population. They kept evolving through the successive waves of immigration. And in the early 19th century, impoverished Yankees and a significant number of African Americans, that is, both free blacks and escaped slaves, lived in areas like 5 Points. By the mid-century, the Irish had become the dominant group in many downtown slums. Their dominance marked by the 1850s, when nearly every shanty or cellar in 5 Points seemed to house Irish families or boarding houses for Irish laborers. The Germans, who immigrated in large numbers after the 1848 revolutions in Europe, tended to settle in their own district, that is, Klein-Deutschland, on the Lower East Side, which, while dense, achieved somewhat more stable petit bourgeois character with many German-run businesses. So it wasn't really seen as quite as lawless as a purely Anglo-Irish slum. After the Civil War, immigration from southern and eastern Europe surged. By the 1880s, the ethnic map of Manhattan's tenements was changing. Italians concentrated in the Mulberry Bend area, part of the old 5 Points neighborhood, that is, turning it into Little Italy. This district around Mulberry Street, Baxter Street, and the Bend, which is the sharp elbow curve of Mulberry Street, grew notorious in the 1880s for even worse conditions than 5 Points had seen. Jacob Riis in 1890 wrote that while 5 Points had been cleansed to an extent, the worst rookeries were torn down, the Mulberry Bend, just a stone's throw away, had outdone even 5 Points in its foulness. And that's not an achievement that you want to unlock. Italian tenement dwellers often arrived as extremely poor rural folk, unfamiliar with urban life, and they crowded into ramshackle buildings, often already old and decayed as it is. One observer described tenement rooms in the Italian Quarter with, quote, hundreds of poor Italians, mostly engaged in carrying through the city the everlasting hand organ or selling plaster statuettes, living together with their monkeys and goats in the same room. I don't know why they'd bring the goats and monkeys with them in the first place, but I'm not Italian, so maybe Italians in the comments can tell me. Well, despite a reputation for being clannish, the Italian immigrants suffered some of the most severe exploitation by landlords and contractors as any other groups. They called them padroni. Many Italian families took in boarders, though, and were noted for trying to save money even under miserable circumstances, hoping to eventually move out of the Bend. Meanwhile, Eastern European Jewish immigrants by the 1880s flooded into the eastern side of the Lower East Side, neighborhoods like the 10th Ward, including Orchard Street, Hester Street, and Delancey Street. This area, derisively called Jew Town by older residents, quickly became the most densely populated place in the city. The Jewish immigrants, often escaping pogroms and persecution in the Russian Empire, brought with them skills in tailoring, baking, and shopkeeping. And as a result, their tenement district was humming with economic activity, particularly the garment industry. Many tenement apartments doubled as sweatshops, of course, where a tailor might employ a few others in a cramped room to sew ready-made clothing. And as Reese observed, one could walk down from an east side street and hear the whir of 1,000 sewing machines from dawn to dusk in the tenements. Well, this meant exhaustive labor for very little pay, often by lamplight with entire families toiling in their own living space. But it also meant that the Jewish neighborhoods, despite poverty, had a slightly different social flavor, one of striving to make livelihoods within the slum. Still, housing conditions were no less crowded, and certainly no less unsanitary. An official count around 1900 found that one Lower East Side block housed over 4,000 people. An oft-quoted statistic that was the density of a population in the 10th Ward was greater than in Bombay or Calcutta. But one other notable community are the Chinese immigrants, who established a small Chinatown centered on Mott Street, overlapping with the Five Points area. By 1880, around a few thousand Chinese lived in New York, and their quarters had opium dens, laundries, and crowded lodging rooms, often in basements. Chinatown was viewed with suspicion and exoticism by the outsiders, but it was essentially another impoverished enclave with high rates of tuberculosis due to overcrowding. Likewise, African Americans who had been a presence in Five Points, a section of the Five Points was even called Little Africa, by the way, were largely pushed out by the mid-century, and they formed other ghettos, such as San Juan Hill in the West 60s, but by the 1890s, certain blocks of Greenwich Village were also settled too. Blacks faced severe housing discrimination as well. Even among slums, they were often confined to the oldest and most dilapidated tenements, and if they could get in, they sometimes even had to pay higher rents for them. Reese in 1890 noted that the color line in New York meant that black families were restricted to particular streets and invariably exploited by landlords. In one case, he cites a respectable black couple with steady work could find no one willing to rent them outside the slum, so they remained paying exorbitant rent in a horrible tenement, enduring ceaseless indignities just because of their skin. But across the river in Brooklyn, which was actually an independent city until 1898, slum conditions also developed, though generally on a smaller scale than Manhattan's. Brooklyn's population too swelled with immigrants, Irish and Germans in the mid-century, Italians and Poles later. The waterfront districts by the Naval Yard and the Red Hook had clusters of cheap tenements for dock workers, and areas like the aptly named Irish Town near Vinegar Hill were known for vice and gang activity. In fact, one Brooklyn slum, nicknamed the Black Sea, lay just off Brooklyn Bridge's anchorages, and was described in 1870 as a warren of rear shanties and saloons frequented by petty criminals. Brooklyn reformers like Alfred T. White made efforts to improve housing. White built model tenements in the 1870s to show that clean, airy apartments for the poor could yield a modest profit too. But despite isolated successes, the majority of tenement dwellers in Brooklyn lived under similar overcrowded conditions as their Manhattan counterparts. In fact, by 1880, Brooklyn's death rate 23 per 1,000, was only slightly lower than Manhattan's 26 per 1,000, indicating widespread urban poverty in that city as well. So really, the grass was not as green as they thought. But of course, things had to get better after a while, didn't they? By the end of the 19th century, the deplorable state of the slums had prompted a variety of responses. Well, from within the communities themselves, and from the society at large. There was a burgeoning sense of social reform taking hold among the middle-class New Yorkers, influenced by the national progressive movement, and a sense of the city's future stability, depending on addressing the tenement question. One major turning point was the publication of Jacob Riis's book, called How the Other Half Lives, in 1890. Now, we've mentioned Riis a few times, and, well, he's kind of the main character in this story. He was a Danish immigrant turned journalist, and he himself had experienced homelessness in New York. He used pioneering flash photography to capture the images of slum interiors and alleyways. The shock of seeing these photographs, of the ragged children sleeping in the stairwells, the malnourished family in a tiny airless room, and of a drunken lodging house keeper brandishing a knife, jolted the conscience of many readers. Riis combined his photos with vivid writing, declaring that the tenements were, quote, the wicked result of public neglect and private greed, hotbeds of epidemics, nurseries of pauperism and crime that threatened the whole city. Riis and other reformers didn't merely sensationalize, they advocated concrete changes. Throughout the 1890s, housing reform bills were introduced in Albany, that was the state capital at the time, aiming to improve new tenement construction and raise the worst old rookeries. The efforts bore fruit in the landmark New York Tenement House Act of 1901, which came just after our period, of course, but that was the culmination of the late 19th century activism. This law mandated taller ceilings, courtyards for ventilation, indoor toilets, and of course a whole bunch of other improvements in the new tenements. It effectively banned the dark, tightly packed design of the past. Before that, an 1895 Tenement House Committee investigation had used photography and surveys much like Riis's work to persuade legislators that stricter laws were needed. It's hard to argue against the photographic evidence, that's for sure. Notably, some notorious slum blocks were cleared toward the end of the century. Mulberry Bend, the heart of the Italian slum, was condemned and turned into a park by 1897. That's Columbus Park, by the way. This was after Riis personally lobbied for its clearance as a park to give a breathing space to the community. Philanthropic organizations also multiplied, attempting to ameliorate conditions. The 5 Points Mission, established by Methodist women in 1850, was one of the first, providing a chapel, school, and eventually taking over the old brewery site to build a clean mission house. Throughout the century, missions and churches in slums offered soup kitchens, laundry facilities, and basic education. The Children's Aid Society, founded in 1853 by Charles Loring Brace, set up industrial schools in tenement districts to teach poor kids practical skills and get them off the streets. And then they opened the famous New Boys Lodging House in 1854, a dormitory where homeless newsboys could get a meal and a bed for a few cents in lieu of sleeping in alleys. Such efforts saved many children from crime or starvation, although they could only help a fraction of those in need. But from within these communities there were also strategies of resilience. Immigrant mutual aid societies formed. For example, German workers might join a sickness benevolent society, or Italian villagers formed hometown societies that collected funds to bury deceased members and assist the unemployed. Jews formed numerous charities and labor unions that fought against the worst exploitations of the sweatshop system. And of course, that didn't eliminate poverty, but They did provide some social support in an environment where the government relief was minimal. You see, public relief in the 19th century was mostly limited to municipal almshouses and orphanages, which, well, they were grim institutions themselves. There was also a political dimension that has to be discussed. Slum dwellers became the backbone of certain political machines, most famously Tammany Hall. Ward bosses from Tammany Hall, that is the Democratic Party machine, like the legendary George Washington Plunkett and Big Tim Sullivan, built power by doing small favors for tenement constituents, finding jobs for immigrants, distributing coal and food in hard winters, overlooking illegal saloons in exchange for votes. While often corrupt, this system at least acknowledged the slums as a significant constituency. Progress in small amounts, I suppose. Well, paradoxically, Tammany politicians both exploited the slums and at times championed reforms that benefited them. For instance, Tammany supported the first Tenement House Act when public pressure grew, and later backed labor laws. In any case, by 1900, the attention given to slum conditions was yielding a few improvements. The death rates were slowly declining. Public health drives had inoculated many children against smallpox and began to curb tuberculosis through education. A cleaner water supply, the Croton system and later additional aqueducts, and more effective garbage disposal. The Department of Street Cleaning, headed by Colonel George Waring in the late 1890s, famously put street sweepers in white uniforms to emphasize sanitation, but they contributed to a less lethal urban environment than that of 1850. I suppose we can say that sanitation workers have saved a lot more lives than doctors have. Still, the fundamental problems of overcrowding and poverty persisted. A visitor in 1899 to the Lower East Side would still find families tend to a room, and might still witness scenes that echoed Dickens and Reese. The children in rags, playing in the gutters, the tired laborers falling asleep on tenement stoops after long work days. Once again, the theme is progress, sure, but progress is usually quite slow. So all in all, it's a pretty grim tale, isn't it? The slums are a sobering study in hardship amid urban plenty. Well, for historians, the 19th century slum offers a valuable lesson, I suppose. In many ways, they were the byproduct of New York's phenomenal growth. A bad bargain struck as the city became the nation's economic powerhouse. The labor of tenement dwellers helped build the wealth of the metropolis, even as they themselves remained trapped in squalor. Yeah. They also show the resilience of communities too. Immigrant cultures blooming in adversity and reform movements rising to tackle this seemingly impossible problem. Thanks to reformers, by 1900, inspired by first-hand witnesses like Reese, society had at least began to take responsibility for conditions once deemed inevitable. There used to be the attitude, of course they're going to live in filth. They're poor. That's how the poor live. It's not a very nice way to think, but that's just how it was back then. Still, maybe things will never be perfect. I don't know. In a system like what we have in most Western countries, there's always going to be people who get left behind. Maybe it's our job to give them a hand a little bit, I suppose that struggle for survival will continue to go on and on and on. It's just part of being human, I guess. In any case, always remember there's somebody who's doing worse than you are. And well, you can try and help them out where you can, at least. Now I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. Good little transition there, I suppose. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, not Ali, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednea, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum? Rhonda, Carrie, Catty P, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, and Rosie. And that's it for today. Really do hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed going through this one. And yeah, more like this to come soon. And I think it's better that we talk about the majority of normal people with history. And, it's not all just about the battles and the kings and the generals, all that sort of thing. There's a situation at the base levels of society that's not as glamorous as the history books would tell you. So until then, I wish you all the best, lots of love to you all, and farewell for now.